we talked about some of that last week. We're not going to talk about that right there tonight. I wish we had time to mention the similarities and the differences. I've got them in my notes. If any of you want to talk to me after class, we'll find them. John T. Johnson was a great guy that worked with, that lived in the same community with Barton Stone, and they invited the Campbell side to hold some meetings with them, and he's probably the guy that had the biggest role in getting the groups to come together as one unit. Raccoon John Smith, man, I'd love to do 16 weeks on Raccoon Smith. And John Rogers is a fellow who traveled with Raccoon Smith. One was from Stone Movement and one was from the Campbell side, and they traveled together in the year after that meeting in Lexington and into all the small rural churches in Kentucky at least and most of the Ohio River Valley, and encouraged those groups to meet together, to not be meeting separately. And in most cases they did. But of course, each church being autonomous, it was their choice. There wasn't any board telling them they had to or needed to or whatever. It was their choice. But in most cases they did. And so, we're just going to start talking about the church in the Civil War this evening. Again, this is one of those things that we probably need about 5 weeks to talk about instead of one 40-minute session. But we're going to try to hit some highlights and say some stuff that might be interesting to you. When we think about the Civil War, we think of a period that is only between the years 1861 and 1865, but the truth of the matter is the effect of it on the nation and the church included many years on either side of that, many years before and many years after. So for at least since 1855, political disagreements, political upheaval had been fomenting, and it was just about to come to its peak and come to blows, literally. So, at the outbreak of the Civil War, we all know from American history it was just an agonizing time that no one knew if our nation would survive it, and equally, no one knew if our churches would survive it. And frankly, most didn't. It was just a horrible time, something to endure, and we certainly were not going to survive as a unified people. There had been 3 decades, from 1832 until 1861, where there had just been enormous growth in the Christian movement in America. All kinds of great things had taken place. Churches grew in numbers. Colleges were established all over what was America then. Colleges that were big, good colleges that were well known all across America and some across the world. There was Bacon College and Franklin College and Bethany and Butler in Indianapolis. Butler's still on the same campus today. Butler College is a first Christian church founded school. Most of us don't know anything about Butler unless they've got a really good basketball team, and then in the Final Four we find out about Butler ever so often. Those schools and others were really great schools that were founded during that 30-year period. But we're going to find out what happens during the war to those schools, the students, the faculty, to everybody. The most significant area was in the Ohio, really on the Ohio Valley and the border states of Kentucky and Missouri. When the war broke out, well, in 1860, there were about 1,200 churches in the Christian faith, the Christian religion, in the north, and about 800 churches in the south when the war broke out. But in Kentucky and Missouri, this is where loyalties were so divided that Christian was set against Christian, brother against brother, oftentimes father against sons. And you can imagine extended family, how many chose one side or the other. But I can tell you this, especially the younger men in America at that time were going to go. They were going to defend their section, the South or the North. And very often they had no idea why, except that they were South and they were North. And that's really all they knew, is that they were fighting each other and they were going to defend their country. Especially, of course, when the war broke out, secession had already taken place. And that was going to be a big deal. As you went to church in these states on Sunday morning, things had changed dramatically, and they were changing dramatically every week. Thomas Munell of Mount Sterling, Kentucky, told about the tension in the congregations all over the border states in a letter that he wrote to David Oliphant. We haven't even mentioned David Oliphant, who was an incredible editor and teacher and preacher in the church. And he wrote this letter in 1862, and he said, "In many Kentucky churches, Union and Confederate sympathizers were attempting to worship together, to sing the same songs, to eat and drink from the same bread and wine, and to say amen to the same prayers. Yet it seemed as if they prayed to different gods." A guy from the north would get up and pray, and he'd lead a prayer, sincerely lead a prayer. And in his prayer, he would typically say, "God, we know that you understand that we're on the right side of this conflict and that we represent you. And we ask you to bless us in this endeavor. And we ask you to keep us safe." And then at the end of service, a Confederate would get up and pray. And he'd say, "God, we know that you know that we're on the right side of this. We ask you to keep our soldiers safe. We ask you to keep our sons safe. We ask you to keep our families together. We know that you will bless us." They're going to church together. It's in the same service. So you can imagine the tensions of that going on at that time. The atmosphere was so tense that if a preacher had supported one side or the other from the pulpit in one of those states, then he would have destroyed the church on that day. They were kind of looking for an excuse to tear each other up. And he would have given them the excuse. So you can imagine the situation the poor preacher's in those congregations. Most large bodies of denominations were by then divided north and south. And Munell wrote to encourage Oliphant to help prevent that in the Restoration churches. And he ended his letter by saying, "We hope not to divide north and south churches as others have. It is my humble opinion that brother should not kill brother." From Lincoln's election until the firing of those first shots at Fort Sumter, there was an intense excitement, the like of which had not been seen before in this land, all over the land. During the time, November of 1860 to April 61, Talbert Fanning, who was the most powerful of the Southern preachers, was on a journey through Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia preaching. Talbert Fanning was another great restoration preacher that you might want to research on your own if you ever get a chance. Talbert Fanning was the Secretary of Agriculture of Alabama. He was an incredible agriculturalist. He was an amazing preacher. He and his wife were great educators. They started school for boys and they started a school for girls. And they had two schools. And they were some of the greatest educators in America at that time. Talbert Fanning was an amazing leader and very well thought of. And when he arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, the state legislature was in session. And Fanning confessed that he never knew what political excitement was until he saw it with his own eyes in Jackson on that trip. As he listened to the speeches of the great Southern orators, he realized that it was never a question of if, but rather when and how Mississippi would secede from the Union. T.W. Caskey, who was another veteran, older preacher from the South, was among the very men who wrote the Order of Secession for the state of Mississippi. The war changed the spirit in the church from a spirit of God to a spirit of war, just as it has on the outside of the church. For the most part, church didn't look at it any differently than anybody else. 14 years before the Civil War, Fanning had preached in Jackson, Mississippi to audiences that filled the chamber of the House of Representatives. That was the largest meeting place they had. He preached there a couple of weeks to a standing room only crowd each night. But this trip, he preached 2 sermons in a very, very small church to about 12 people each night. That's how things had changed in Jackson. He went from there to Vicksburg and down to New Orleans, where he found only 3 Christians in worship on Sunday. From there he went to Mobile, Alabama, and from Mobile throughout all of Alabama, arriving in Montgomery, the capital of the state. He found a city that was in such turmoil that no one had time or thought of the Lord. Never mentioned the Lord or God. Certainly no one was worshiping on the Lord's day. He set out for Atlanta because he knew a brother, A.G. Thomas, in Atlanta. He knew him to be a fine man, a man of superior address and superior talents and learning. But in him he found a man with a feather in his hat and a glittering sword in his right hand. And Fanning famously addressed him by saying, "Dr. Thomas, I'm not sure that it's possible for you to hold the sword of Georgia in one hand and the sword of the Spirit in the other." Now, personally, I would disagree with that. I know there are times when Christians go to war and need to. And I'm sure that A.G. Thomas at that time thought this was one of those times. At the same time, in the north, Alexander Campbell was on a preaching tour. And he was in Indianapolis. And he was having a whole lot more success because it was more urban, not so rural. And he preached to larger crowds. He and Isaac Errett were on a trip trying to raise money for Bethany College, to keep Bethany College going. And they had a lot better success. But they didn't always have great success. They preached in a lot of cities, and but as they preached, news came that the war had started. And immediately their success dwindled all at once. D.S. Burnett was there with them as well. He too was very well known. He too was not sure how to accept it all. Errett, Isaac Errett, who was with him, was from Detroit, Michigan. And he was on his way home from the tour when he preached in Anoa. It was a short but successful meeting there, but turmoil was beginning to fill the air, even in the north by then. And Errett continued his tour on behalf of Bethany College and in Illinois and then down into Virginia, but with lessening success at each stop, with smaller crowds at each stop. And news came of Anderson's surrender at Fort Sumter, and madness filled and ruled the hour. Men in the north cursed those in the south and vice versa. And Errett knew he better get back to Detroit as quickly as he could. And he reported that each town, large or small, that he passed through on his way back to Detroit was filled with shouting and hurrahing and flag flying and banners and streamers everywhere. In both the North and the South, members of the church joined in the excitement. Preachers of the Restoration plea stepped down from the pulpit and joined the cause of both sections, North and South. Young men in our Christian colleges left classes to join the armies of each side. At the outset of the war, James A. Garfield was the president of Hiram College in Ohio. Hiram College is still in existence today, the very same school. It's still there. It's a very, very small NCAA Division III school. But it's still there. And he was the president. But he sought a commission from the governor, and it was granted. And he returned to Hiram College, and from the student body, he formed the bulk of the 42nd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. And not only from his college, but he would go on Sunday morning, and as church was out, he'd stand on the steps and recruit the other young men in those churches to be in his regiment as well. In early January of the next year, they fought their first battle in Paintsville, Kentucky, and they were the victors. They quickly then after that joined Grant's army at the Battle of Shiloh. Then they went to Corinth, where they drove the Confederates out, then across Mississippi and Alabama. And by now, Garfield and his boys had attained a significant amount of fame in the Northern Army. At Chickamauga, he was made Brigadier General. But he wasn't for long. He soon resigned from the Army to enter Congress as a representative of Ohio, but his regiment continued to fight. When they first began to fight, there were more than 250 boys from Hiram College in the Union Army. In their very last battle, J.S. Ross, one of those boys, led the company into their very last battle as a captain. We're not sure how many died in the war. A very significant number did. On one occasion, they met in battle a regiment of Southern Army soldiers that included young men who had been their classmates at Hiram College. Some say there were as few as a dozen of men from Hiram College that actually fought for the Confederacy. But however many there were, they were all there that day. Can you fathom that? Kids that months before were going to class together, praying together, playing ball together, and having a big time together. We're now on a battlefield killing each other. And they knew it. And if some of them shot a classmate, they knew he was a classmate. I can't imagine how rough it was for those boys. And I certainly can't imagine what it was like for James A. Garfield, who had been the president of guys on each side. I can't fathom that. Hiram College was not the only school that was affected by the war, but while many students from the north and the southern schools fought and most schools closed during the war, no other school had the total of its faculty and student body involved in fighting like Hiram College, and no other school had the majority of their school lie dead on the battlefields forever like they did. If you think about it and what it meant to the church in the years after, probably 200 preachers or elders or deacons, heads of households, families that would have been in church, families that would have grown up Christian families, never even existed because these young men died on the battlefield in the Civil War. There's no way to calculate what it was. Some of you have probably heard of T.B. Larimore. He joined the Confederate Army the first year of the war. He was in Colonel McClellan's outfit at Knoxville. At the Battle of Fishing Creek in Kentucky, he went with General Buckner under a flag of truce, a white flag, to fetch the body of General Zollicoffer, who had died in battle. And they rode out during the battle under a flag of truce and recovered his body. Larimore somehow was placed in charge of a group of guards at Pittsburgh Landing. They were there to report any Federal landing ships coming up the Mississippi. And it was T.B. Larimore who wrote the dispatch that went to Albert Sidney Johnson, telling him the first gunboats were coming up the Mississippi River. At Franklin College in Nashville, a school that was founded by Talbot Fanning. W.D. Carnes fought frantically to keep the issue of war out of the classroom. But when Lincoln called for volunteers, those kids knew what was about to happen and what was next, and the whole student body left to join the Confederate ranks. Most of these boys died on the battlefields all over the country, and Franklin College never reopened. Arkansas College, where William Baxter was president, almost entirely made up of members of the Church of Christ. Baxter knew that the students were from both sentiments, so he tried to keep the political discussions at a low tone. And again, when Lincoln called for volunteers, he knew that most of those students, or many of them, would go and enlist. And sure enough, it was only a couple of days before students reported to him and told him they were enlisting. It was very hard for the faculty, especially for Baxter, because he knew there was no way to convince them otherwise. He got them all together one night, had them round up in a circle like we often do, hold hands and sing hymns together and pray for each other. And then off they went, to the north and to the south in about equal numbers. That school never reopened either. When the last gun of war was fired, many, if not most of these boys also lay sleeping on the battlefields from Gettysburg to Pea Ridge to Prairie Grove. Those are the two key battles in Arkansas that we know most about. Fayetteville itself became one large hospital after the Battle of Prairie Grove. Union Confederate soldiers were crying in agony anywhere where they could be laid down in Fayetteville. Robert Graham was the man who had founded Arkansas College and was forced to leave Fayetteville because he'd been too vocal in support of the Union. But Baxter remained to see doctors cutting off arms and legs without the use of anesthesia or antiseptic, either one. And he was there to hear the screams of agony. And even worse than that, he was still there a week later to see the bloated bodies lying all over the town of Fayetteville. Many, many of them, kids he had taught in college. He also was there to witness as bodies of young men were brought in from the battlefield dead to the church building and laid down in the pews where their moms and dads came and identified them. At the Battle of Pea Ridge, a regiment of Texas Rangers joined the Confederate cause under General McCulloch. This regiment was led by Barton W. Stone, Jr., the son of the renowned Barton Stone from Kentucky. The chaplain of that regiment was B.F. Hall. Before the Battle of Pea Ridge, when the Confederates were camped in Fayetteville, Baxter and Graham, those two men from the College of Arkansas, decided to pay a visit to Stone and Hall. Church preachers, Church of Christ preachers. No mention was made of their visit with Stone, which leads us to assume that it went as you might expect it to. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the meeting with Hall was of great regret. They found B.F. Hall to have changed completely. They found him to be advocating the Southern cause so strongly that he acted more like a fiend than a Christian. He was riding a fine mule. He carried a splendid rifle, a glittering sword, and he was heard to request in a very loud voice, "If a Yankee appeared, please let him get his share." Graham was a Yankee himself, and Baxter knew that he had just prayed with the young men from both camps the last day of school at Arkansas College. And they're there to hear that and witness that. In their talk with Hall, there was no mention of Christ or church, only how many Yanks he would kill before the end of the next day. As for what became of Hall, 2 days later the battle was on, and Baxter and Graham stood on a porch in a home in Fayetteville and watched as McCullough's army poured back through town in retreat. Hall was very visible. No mule, no sword, no splendid rifle, head down, very worn and very tired and defeated. Not quite as arrogant. I guess he had had all the Yank he wanted. After the war, Hull made his way back into the pulpit, preaching the same salvation he had always preached. But he had a bit of a different reputation, and he wasn't quite as influential as he was before. But B.F. Hall was a great preacher, especially in the state of Texas. It's amazing how much good he did after the war. He just flat lost his mind, as so many people did, and still do over politics, by the way. During the war, there were many dark deeds done by members of the church on both the Union and Confederate sides. One Christian is known through history not for what he did, but because of what was done to him. And his name was Andrew Alsman. He was a prisoner of war in Missouri, one of the states that's divided. When a Confederate General Porter took him out one day to the middle of the street and totally unwarranted shot him dead. A lot of witnesses. We're in a border state. So in retaliation, General McNeil selected 10 men of his Confederate prisoners to be shot. And in a show of cruelty, those men were put in a separate jail and were taunted and to think about the fate that was coming to them. Jacob Creeth Jr., another one of those guys I wish we had time to talk about. Man, what a great preacher. What an amazing man. A man who was present at Barton Stone's death, in the same room with Barton W. Stone when he died. Jacob Creeth was called to speak to those guys, those 10 guys. And many of them begged for pardon. One suggested that he be the one that was killed and the other 9 be sent back to prison. But he could do nothing to help them. All he could do was to beg them to be ready because they were going to die. And they needed to get right with God. And the next morning, all 10 were. There's many, many, many stories like that. a great preacher from Iowa, John B. Balder, spent time in Andersonville prison. If you know much about the Civil War at all, you know Andersonville was the absolute worst place you could go to spend time in a prison during the war. It was brutal. He was there for about a year, but he survived, and then later he was in Sherman's march across the South. Just so many other stories. I won't be telling you a bunch more of them. But so went the war. Churches in some places divided. Others just became discouraged and ceased to meet forever. Shut down, closed. The churches that had grown out of the Restoration movement reacted to war as all other churches in America did. If God did not take a back seat, certainly without question, church did. I can imagine not a day going by when those guys didn't pray to God. I can't imagine men being in battle at any point and not praying to God often. But there was never a mention or a thought of church that we have any record of. I'm sure there were some boys who thought about home. And when they thought about home, they thought about going to church with their families. And I'm sure they missed it desperately. But nobody wrote anything down about it. That's just an assumption I have, which I think is very logical. Christians quickly were caught up in the sectional passions. Religion was largely abandoned. All energy turned toward war. Loyal friends became hated enemy. Congregations grew smaller until they just no longer existed. There really were two questions the church had to answer. There were many questions, but two major questions the church had to answer about the war. First one dealt with slavery. Could a Christian own slaves? And a whole bunch of well-known preachers owned slaves. A bunch of them owned slaves. And the second one was, does the Christian have a right to go to war and kill his fellow man, or especially another brother? Conscientious objectors is nothing new. And some people just didn't think it was right. Some people thought it was absolutely right. And they were as sincere in their thoughts as you and I are in any of ours. It was a battle within a man, not just a battle on a battlefield. I don't know how much you know about American history, but if you study very much about the Civil War, you know the atrocities of war were incredible. You also know of the atrocities that happened in the South after war by men from the North. Carpetbaggers that are just unbelievable. The church was no different than any of the rest of it. None at all. I talked already a great deal about the effect on colleges and college students. Many teachers' fault. We've talked about some of them. As for James A. Garfield, let us mention one other interesting fact, and I've already mentioned it, but I want to emphasize it. James A. Garfield not only recruited kids from his college to be in his regiment and go to war with him, he recruited young men at churches everywhere. That was his regiment, members of the church, young men, members of the church. And James A. Garfield was a man of the highest integrity that you can ever imagine, and honest to the core. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about the Gainesville Vigilante Committee. Any of you know about that? Have any of you ever read about the vigilante committees during the Civil War? During the Civil War, there was no law enforcement, hardly anywhere, and especially in rural areas. You talk about the Wild West, the man with the biggest gun, the man that was the meanest spirited, they're the guys that ran the show. And there were vigilante committees, especially across the South, many of them. But this story about Gainesville Committee involves a couple of well-known preachers from the state of Texas that we'll talk about next week or whenever I get to speak again when we talk about the church in Texas. This story was written in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram about 75 years after the war ended. It was, I think, in October of 1949 that this story appeared in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. It says that during the Civil War, organized law enforcement still was superseded by community action, represented by high vigilance committees, and they ruled the land. And the one in Gainesville had as their mission to locate and liquidate traitors of the Confederacy. And they did, by hanging. 40 were hung in Gainesville in October of 1862. 40 in that month. Not too very long ago, there was a historical marker put up and on the spot where most of the hangings took place. And for years and years and years, they tried to sweep it under the rug and hope nobody ever knew about it in Gainesville. But finally, they knew that everybody knew, and it needed to be marked in a historical way. One of the men arrested and brought before the committee at Gainesville was Dr. Mansell Matthews. He was a noted evangelist who was traveling by caravan and who was popular in the Fort Worth region. He was popular everywhere, but was popular in the Fort Worth region, and he was on his way there. He was rounded up. He was accused of treason against the secession from the United States. And that was the same charge of any that this vigilante committee wished to put to death. There was absolutely no evidence of it that we can find anywhere in history. But upon hearing that he had been arrested and put in jail and was going to be tried, there was a very well-known builder in Fort Worth named E.M. Daggett. Had any of you ever heard of Mr. Daggett? E.M. Daggett is a big-time fella in Fort Worth history. He was an early builder in Fort Worth. He journeyed to Gainesville as quickly as he got the word and got there as soon as he could. And he got there in time to address the court. Most of these guys didn't have anybody to defend them in court. But Mr. Daggett was there. And he was such a big name in the state and so influential that they let him speak. And he was told the court that Matthew's mind might be with the Union, but his heart was with the South. And he spoke for about 30 minutes on his behalf. And in an incredible event, I absolutely believe, by the grace of God, Mansell Matthews, Dr. Matthews, was spared. His life was spared. But they couldn't stand it. The committee could not stand it. So they said, okay, he'll live. But we're going to keep him in jail 3 more days, making him think he's fixing to die. And let him think about it. Well, Daggett thought that was overly cruel. So, he was determined to tell Matthews that he was safe. So he begged to visit with him. He said, I've ridden my horse all this way to be here to defend the man I love. I ought to be able to sit down with him for 5 minutes. And they said, you can under 2 conditions. You do not tell him his life has been spared, and we're sending a guard with you to make sure you don't. Because if you do, not only will his life be taken, but yours will as well. So he went back to visit with him, and they didn't put a time limit on it, so he stayed as long as he wanted. And they talked and talked and talked. And much of their talk was about Bible. And that guard got bored. And he began to, kind of like y'all do when I'm preaching. And so, when he was sure, Daggett was sure, that the guard was so inattentive, he asked Matthews for his favorite Bible quotation, his favorite verse. And Matthews gave it to him. And then Matthews asked Daggett, what is yours? And Daggett, knowing that the guard was not listening closely, responded with this Bible verse. Listen closely. On this day I find mine to be. Fret not thy gizzard, and gizzle not thy whirligig. Thy soul are surely saved. Now, if you can find that in the Bible, good luck. But Mansell Matthews knew immediately he wasn't going to die. And so, not to give it away, he didn't look up. He just looked down and kind of trembled. And you can imagine the emotion that came over him. And Matthews knew he was safe. something that's confusing to me. Matthews is said to have freed his Negro slaves after the war. It baffles me that God-fearing proclaimers of the word considered it acceptable to own men. Just blows my mind. Yet more than just a few did. And I know there's all kinds of Bible examples about slavery. Okay, we're not going to talk about the American Christian Missionary Society. It helped a great deal to divide the churches. The American Christian Missionary Society was an organization by the churches to organize, an attempt to organize. Most people were not really in favor of it in the South anyway. And when the war broke out, they took out ads in their journals in support of the North. You know, more or less saying, sign up to kill those Southern Christians. And so that didn't help at all. Well, let's talk about what happened to the church. As you may well imagine, the church divided. The North and South churches were never really brothers again. I don't know, maybe they are today. If they are, it's fairly new in my lifetime. I will tell you this. When I go with Jerry up to Wisconsin to that Bible retreat, I fall in love with those guys in a heartbeat. I don't discuss the Civil War with them. There's no reason to. But I have never discussed God more deeply with anybody than I have with those gentlemen and wives. It's astounding. And I can guarantee you those people are my brothers and sisters. And Brenda, I think, would tell you the same thing. And I know Jerry would. And so I feel like probably we're not nearly as divided from the Civil War, but we're still divided over some things. And the Christian church and the Church of Christ are divided over some issues. The greatest division that we've ever had, Northern churches against Southern, has not been over instrumental music. It's not been over societies. It's not been over whether you have Bible classes, whether you drink from one cup or you drink from 400 as we do on a Sunday morning. Its greatest division we've ever had has been the Civil War, when we literally killed each other on purpose. And another thing that shattered our brotherhood as a result of that was all of these colleges, great, great colleges that never recovered. And all of these rural churches that never recovered. And all of these young men that never became preachers are heads of families that were Christians, who had sons and grandsons and great-grandsons and daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters to have an influence on the world for the cause of Christ. Never ever have we been in a war where as many young men lie dead forever on battlefields anywhere as the Civil War. And never ever has the church been affected with deaths as it was from that. It's not just that generation. It's generation after generation after generation that never existed because they died on those battlefields. I don't know if you've ever considered that, but it's astounding. Folks, I've talked to you tonight about maybe 1/10 of what happened in the church during the Civil War. But I hope that I've given you a glimpse of how tragic and how lasting it is for us still today. I think it's important that we know it. Okay, I'm done. Y'all can go home.
Buddy, what were the charges that the vigilante